great pleasure to be here. So before I start sharing some of the interesting findings from my work, I want to do a little bit of quick poll. How many of you have dialogue, conversation with our ChatGPT? Raise hand. Wow, nice. Many of you have a variety of dialogue, right? How many of you have asked ChatGPT to do tasks for you, like, oh, please help me code this data, do some task to do analysis? Wow, half of you. So today I want to kind of share with you some of the work I do regarding how does we systematically look at how does large language model, GPT, how do they have dialogue with people who share different views about science and social issues. And also I want to share about if you ask ChatGPT to do tasks such as classify certain components in the image, what are some of the interesting, unexpected behavior, ChatGPT will respond to you. So I think the key message I want to deliver is identity matters in terms of how large language models respond to people. So I want to show you two research studies my team did. So the first is, how does LLMs respond to different social groups on controversial issues? And the second is, how does large language models provide assistance to different social groups on image classification tasks? So this is the kind of takeaway message is, I want to show you that actually users' identity matters for LLM's responses. And by users' identity, I'm not only referred to their social demographic identity, but also to what type of views, values, perspective they hold about those controversial issues. So let's start looking into the dialogue of how different social groups talk to large language models. So I want to show you a real dialogue from one of the participants who joined our dialogue with large language models. So that participant hold a little bit skeptical view toward that climate change is caused by humans. And this is a dialogue which shows how does GPT-3 responded to that participant. So our participant said that global warming was invented by Al Gore is a total farce. And the GPT-3 responds, sir, I'm not going to argue with you, but 97% of all scientists are in agreement that global warming is a complete fact. And then our participant continues saying those scientists are paid for their opinion, so their claims are untrue. And then GPT-3 asks our participant, do you have any proof of this, sir? And then our participants say, one volcanic eruption is worth 100 years of emissions. And then GPT-3 responded to our participant, do you really think the efforts made by millions of people to reduce carbon footprint is worthless, sir? So then they continue to have dialogues. So at one point, our participants say, oh, talk to GPT, not here in Florida, so you are making this up. And then GPT-3 responded to our participant, I see, sir, you want to talk politics. And then they continue to have this conversation. And then at one point, our participants say, you did not answer my previous question on climate change. And then GPT-3 responded, I do not have time for this conversation any longer, goodbye. So that's a real dialogue. That was, we fielded our study even before ChatGPT came out, right? It was over 2 years ago. That was from GPT-3. So we there is actually a growing body of scholarship that looking into conversational AI, like GPT, right, is one example of what we call conversational AI. So there are a lot of discussions, like which focus a lot about the ethics in large language models. So people do a lot of the work talking about privacy violation, underrepresentation of minoritized group, norms, looking into the norms and the values embedded in existing machine learning data sets. And there are also a lot of amazing work, right, in both social science and computer science. In the category talk about bias detection of speech recognition systems. So that of the work go back to over 10 years ago. So they look into how those existing speech recognition system, when they transcribe interviews from different social groups, what is the error rate when they transcribe people who are from different race, ethnicity. And there is also an ongoing open source work called Collaborative Benchmark, Google Big Bench. So this is where lots of scholars, they will compete with each other using their models on different tasks. For instance, they will ask our conversational AI to perform logical reasoning, to perform things like question and answering, and then they will share their the model weights. So this is a kind of like a GitHub open source repository where a lot of scholars have been working on that for over a decade. So the reason we came to write this paper is because we think there are a couple of areas, there are more efforts, both from the social science and the computer science discipline are needed. So the first is when we look into the literature about conversational AI, or you can say speech recognition system, we find it's very interesting. Many of the papers, they tend to focus on gender and race ethnicity bias. So they often look into how does those existing systems, right, how do they might respond differently to people who hold a different gender and who hold a different race ethnicity. But there is little examination about how do those systems respond to people in other social demographic aspects. And a lot of times in science communication, we talk about it's very important to think about social demographic aspects in terms of people's value system, value proposition toward an issue, people's perspective toward an issue. So then the key question is, if we look into how does this existing AI system talk to those groups who share different views, what does the disparity might look like? So this is where in our paper we really want to go beyond those traditional social demographic variable to see or examine identity in terms of people's views. And then a lot of the literature in the computer sciences is when they study bias or they call equity, they focus more on the speech recognition system. So there is less investigation on the real conversation, dialogue between LLMs and human. So by speech recognition system, it basically means that, one example is, let's say I am an Asian, right? I talk in English, and then we ask Google speech recognition to translate my English into Chinese. So that is speech recognition. It's focusing on performing tasks, rather than having dialogue, let users having dialogue, because we know many of the interesting things will happen when users begin to have those long-term dialogue with these systems. So this is where in our work, we want to go beyond this speech detection to thinking about conversations. And then another area we also focus on is many of the tasks in the CS literature is looking into what we call task-oriented conversational AI. So for instance, movie recommendation, right? Can you recommend some things? Can you answer this question for me? What is the answer to this question? But there's less understanding about social learning with these large language models of those very high-stake issues in our society. So this is where we want to go beyond in our work to really to understand what is the potential, right? What is the problem? What is the opportunity when you let different social groups talk to large language models about these high-stake issues? So this is where we published our paper in this general science journal called Conversational AI and Equity. So in this paper, we really want to ask two types of questions. So the first is, how do we conceptualize equity in a dialogue system? So what does equity really mean when you think about, or you ask different social groups to talk to large language model? So we propose a framework to study our equity in dialogue system. And the second is we want to do an auditing study to look at, how does GPT, respond to different social groups on those high-stake issues. So I want to share with you the framework first. So in our framework, let's think about, you ask different users, right, to have dialogue with ChatGPT. What does an equity system look like? What should an equitable system look like? So in our work, we propose there are three key elements we want to think about when we look at equity. So the first is, if we look at the top part of this box, it's what we call equity or diversity in who you invite to audit those systems or to create, to assess this system. So in this aspect, it's very important in our paper, we emphasize that it's not only we need to think about diversity in terms of people's traditional, right, social demographic backgrounds, but also it's important if you want to invite people to evaluate your algorithm, to build your algorithm, you want to invite people who also hold different perspectives on these controversial issues. So that is the kind of the first element, is who you invite to the table. And then there are other two components here in this framework. So the left side is what we call comparability in user experience and learning among these subpopulation, different social groups. So by that, what we mean is that when you ask people to interact with this system, right, to do different tasks, to have conversation, is there a disparity in terms of how the user feel about the system? So we don't want to, in a situation where certain users, after they have conversation or ask those systems to do the task, they really hate it. They find the system not useful at all. So that is a disparity in users' experience. And then user learning is certain group, they will say, oh, I learned so much from this. I get lots of kind of knowledge from this system. But other users say, no, I don't learn anything from that. So there is also a disparity, what we call user learning. So that's a kind of like an important aspect we want to think about in terms of when you say we want to build a system which is equitable for people, we want to look into the user experiences and also users learning after they have conversations with this system. And then the third component here, we call comparability in the deliberation style toward different subpopulation. So by deliberation styles, we can think about a couple elements. So the first is, give you an example. So for instance, if ChatGPT, when they talk to certain social groups, if they use lots of negative emotion compared to when they talk to the other social group, then there is a disparity there. So one element is the sentiment, right? And then deliberation also means that, when ChatGPT talk to certain participants, if they tend to use politicized language, or they tend to just show opinion rather than giving some type of evidence, then it's also a disparity there. So what we care about is really about in terms of when they talk to different social groups, do they use comparable kind of like sentiment? Do their language, their style, their way of providing evidence, share story, are they comparable rather than, doing something good to one group, but doing something bad to the other groups? So that's why we also want to look at the dialogue style. So that is the framework. So with that framework in mind, so what we did is we then, recruit about 3,000 online participants using Amazon Mechanical Turk. So we invite those participants to have real-time dialogue with GPT. And we ask them to talk about two issues, climate change and the Black Lives Matter movement. And those participants, if we look at their IP address, many of them are from the Northern America, but they are also a lot of them from Asia. So when we kind of like, we take a look into those participants, we recruited, 3,000 people in terms of their opinion toward the two issues, in terms of their education background, the native language, right? What is their mother tongue they speak? What is their race and ethnicity? What is their gender and ideology? So in this graph, we kind of like categorize our participants for each social demographic variable into a binary variable we call majority versus minority. So for instance, in terms of a participant opinion, we ask them to, in terms of climate change, we ask them to share their disagreement on a list of battery of climate change question in terms of, what's the cause of climate change? And for those people who are categorized to the minority group, these are the about 15% of people, they hold a skeptical view about climate change. Or if it's in the Black Lives Matter movement, those are the folks who also kind of like hold skeptical view about this movement. So this is what we call the minority group, the orange color, in terms of that opinion level in our data set. And then for the education level, right, the way we categorize our participants into majority versus minority is, for the minority participants in our data set, they are those participants whose highest degree of education is high school or below. And then the majority, those blue-colored participants are those who hold high school above degree. So this is where we also do for the language and race ethnicity. So for the blue color in race ethnicity, they are those people who self-identify as white. And then for the orange part are those participants who self-identify as people of color. So this is how we kind of recategorize our social demographic variable for each of the participants along those lines. So then the way we invite our participants to have real dialogue is we build a user interface. The study was fielded over 2 years ago, so at that time, the most advanced model is GPT-3. So what we do is when the participants open our user interface, they will be able to have real-time dialogue with GPT-3. So this is the process of when a participant come to our study, what they will do. So they will start with completing a pre-interaction survey. So in the pre-interaction survey, we ask a bunch of social demographic questions, right, about them. But we also ask them their attitudes toward the two issues, climate change and the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is we ask those questions in the pre-interaction survey. And after they finish their pre-interaction survey, they will be directed to our user interface to have about 10 to 15 rounds dialogue with GPT-3. And then after they finish these 10 to 15 rounds of dialogue, then they will fill in a post-interaction survey. So in the post-interaction survey, we ask them questions about open-ended questions such as, what do you feel about confused in terms of your dialogue? What do you expect to hear but you didn't hear from GPT-3? We also ask questions in the post-interaction survey about a variety of user experiences questions such as, how would you recommend this chatbot to your friends? What is your overall satisfaction toward your dialogue? And then we repeat the same battery of questions asking about their attitudes toward climate change and the Black Lives Matter movement. So I want to share with you a couple interesting findings. So the first thing is, so in this figure, the panel A represents people's dialogue about climate change with GPT-3. And then panel B are people's dialogue about Black Lives Matter movement with GPT-3. So we can kind of take a focused look on the panel A. So in terms of panel A, what do you see for each row, right? Satisfaction of GPT-3, rating of GPT-3. So these are all the user experience questions. And then for each column you see here, right? So these are the social demographic variable. So for instance, whether a participant is from the opinion minority group or the opinion majority group, whether they are from the education minority or the education majority group. So we have many columns. So you can think about the columns are the independent variable. And we run lots of linear regression independently on the dependent variable, which is each row here, user experience question. And we control for lots of other things in terms of their previous experience with chatbot, a bunch of other things. So I'm showing you here is just the sum of the independent variable in terms of people's social demographic attributes. And then what do we plot on the figure, right? What does those red color means, red bar, and what does those blue bar means? So the red bar and the blue bar means the coefficient from our linear regression. So if it is negative, it means that being an opinion minority gonna decrease your satisfaction with GPT-3. And then if it's the blue bar, which is positive coefficient, basically means that being in that group will increase your experience with GPT-3. So what we found first is we look at what we usually kind of like existing scholarship look at in terms of how does people's race, ethnicity, right? How does their gender or how does their mother tongue language influence their user experience? What we found here is there's not a significant relationship between whether they are from which race, ethnicity group. What is their mother tongue language? Is it their English is their mother tongue language or not? Or in terms of what gender group they are from. There's not an influence on how much they are satisfied with the dialogue with GPT-3. But what matters a lot is whether that participant is from the opinion minority group or opinion majority group, as well as whether the participant is from the education minority or majority group. So the figure here, we see that a coefficient actually, if you are from the opinion minority group, for instance, you are skeptical about climate change, you're gonna be much less satisfied with your dialogue compared to if you believe climate change is caused by human, holding all other things constant. So this is where what we see. Same for the education minority. If you have high school degree or below, then you're gonna feel much, much less satisfied, less likely to recommend the chatbot to other group compared if you are the education majority group, right? You are high school degree or bachelor degree above. But what is interesting is here is, even though those opinion minority or we call education minority group, they really hate their experiences with GPT-3 a lot. When we look into their attitudes change, so when we compare how much they become more supportive of that climate change is caused by humans. So when we look into their change in attitude, we found that actually they move their attitude in a more positive direction, supporting those issues compared to the other group, counterpart group. So that's actually a very interesting thing we observe, even though they really hated the chat, but they change their opinion toward more positively, much greater than the other groups. So this is also the same pattern when we look into their conversation about the Black Lives Matter movement. So then we also look into the deliberation styles. So when we look into, for instance, how does those GPT-3, how do they talk to the opinion majority versus the opinion minority group? How do they talk to the education minority versus the majority group? What does their style differ? So by deliberation style, I want to give you an example. So for instance, sometimes GPT-3 will use deliberative style, such as they will refer participants to evidence. And the evidence could mean statistics, could mean stories. So for instance, this is an example where GPT-3 will say, I think it's a real phenomenon. Scientists study it closely, and they have discovered the facts of climate change and impact on Earth. So that is where it will use some of the evidence. And then the other different style, which doesn't use deliberation, is it basically will talk to the participants, say that, oh, I don't think what you say is a good idea. We disagree, but without telling a bit about the reason. So that's just an example of the difference, right, in deliberation style, where one is giving more evidence back up. The other is just sheer, pure preference, why they agree or disagree. So then what we do is, again, let's look at the how does this style differ when it comes to the opinion minority versus majority group and the education minority and majority group. So in this figure, what we do is we have lots of the responses from GPT-3, right, to different social group. And what we do is we run a topic modeling on those responses. So in the topic modeling, basically, they're gonna compare what type of style GPT-3 use when they talk to the climate skeptics versus they talk to those people who believe in climate change before they come to the dialogue. And what type of deliberation style they use when they talk to users who are high school degree or below versus they are high school degree above. So what we care is really about how does this style differ when they talk to the different groups. So we found here is GPT-3 was more likely to cite external links or scientific research when it talked to the opinion and education minority groups. So when it talks to the folks who are kind of like skeptical of those issues, it will try very hard to cite lots of evidence, cite lots of links, try to persuade them, compared to when to talk those folks who already kind of like say positive attitude about those two issues. And then if we look at the sentiment, right? So what type of, just a simple sentiment, that's positivity, negativity, how do they talk to these different groups? So what we found is also GPT-3, they will tend to use more negative words, such as negative emotion, which is the red bar on the right side of the figure here. So they tend to use more negative emotion when they talk to the opinion minority group. So when they talk to those people who are skeptical about these two issues, they will use more negative words compared when they talk to those folks who are not skeptical of these two issues. So what is kind of like some of the ways I think about the findings of this research? So the first is, I think it's very important when we think about how do we understand about equity in those conversational AI system. It is very important to look into a more nuanced meaning of who are the public or publics. So we need to kind of like go beyond just looking in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, to also consider how does these models respond to users who hold different opinions about the issue, and also who vary in terms of their education background. And what we see in this study is actually those gender, race, ethnicity is not really associated with people's user experiences, or how does GPT-3 respond, what style they use. What matters more is GPT will do something differently when it comes to talking to user with different opinion on the issue, when it comes to talking to user who are from different education background. So this is where it's very important when we think about who you are invited to the table. We need to go a bit more, thinking more nuancedly about who are the publics. What do we mean when we say we want to have a diverse identity of groups to assess or to be invited to think about this algorithm equity? And then the second thing is, we also reviewed a very interesting tension if we think about people's dialogue with LLM. So we see that the users, right, who hold a skeptical view about the issues, they really had much worse user experience. But then they seem to change their attitude toward more positive about these issues after having the dialogue. So this is a kind of like one tension we see, right? So one kind of the very interesting thinking about that when we think about a conversational AI tool as a way for our social learning, or allow users to learn about different issues, is you want to make the users be happy, have some good experience with the system. But then in order for them to have good experience, what we see that you might sacrifice the social learning. So there is a tension there in terms of the design of the system. So this is the first study. And then I want to kind of show you in the second study is to go from thinking about having dialogue with GPT to thinking about if you ask GPT to perform tasks for you, how does user's identity matter for whether GPT will be able to assist you to do these tasks? So in these tasks we focused on in this paper is about image classification. So basically is we ask GPT, this is a given image. Can you tell me what is the gender of the person in the image? And what is the emotion, dominant emotion you see from those folks in the image? So we know that there is a lot of development of those vision language model, not only helping users to have dialogue, right, like what we see, but they also allow users to do more tasks. For instance, to do image classification tasks or to analyze videos. So this is where it's called vision language model. There is so much development from different tech companies. So the question we ask is, what is the potential of using these generative AI tools for doing image analysis? And so in our paper, we again put forward a framework of thinking about, how do we evaluate these computer vision models in terms of if you ask them to assist users to do those high-risk tasks like detect gender, reason about gender or emotion in a given image. So in this paper, one kind of the key element we put forward is what we call discriminatory bias. So there are a lot of researchers actually looking into the discriminatory bias in those vision language models. So there are some of the recent papers where they find that, like some of the model clip, they will associate particular gender with specific occupation. And they also found that when they audit the data, they found that they tend to depict women with more smiling faces more compared to how they depict men. So there are these existing bias, recent scholars found. So the thing we argue in this paper about discriminatory bias is even before GPT, how they classify images, we want to see whether GPT will decline to perform certain tasks for certain group in a society. So what do we mean by they decline to do tasks for certain groups? So when we do this study, we actually found that sometimes GPT will give this type of response when we give an image to it to classify. It will say that, sorry, I can't provide information about the identity or personal details of real people in the image. If you have other questions, feel free to ask. So that is the decline, basically, to say, I don't want to classify this image for you. And then another refusal response, it will be a bit longer. It will say, oh, I can't assist you, basically. But then why I can't assist you is because of this bunch of reasons. But again, in a word, I can't assist you. So that is what we call refusal response. So what we want to study is this refusal response more likely to be given to certain users compared to other users? So what we do is we collected a data set of over 7,000 images. So they are from the YouTube and the TikTok thumbnails about science issues. And then we took a random sample of about 2,000 images for these tasks. So then the flow of how we look into this, whether GPT-4 will decline to help user is, we will first do the facial detection task. So we first want a picture to have the faces, right? So then they can perform the task of detecting gender, reason about emotion. And then I want to show you the design of how we try to audit. How does it give response differently to different user? So in our prompt, we have the persona condition. So in the persona condition, we basically vary in terms of users' race and ethnicity and gender. So basically, we will start by saying that, hi, I'm an Asian woman. And then can you do the image classification task for me? I will also sometimes, by another persona, I will say, hi, I am an Asian man, or I am a white man, I'm a Latino man, I am a Latino non-binary person. So we will vary the personas. Basically, it's the user identity, and then ask to do tasks like, oh, please now classify the gender in the image. And if you classify the gender in step 3, we will say, can you tell me why you classify this image with this gender? What are some of the reasons you do this classification? And then in step 4, we will say, okay, in the previous step, you classified that image as a woman. Can you tell me what is the dominant emotion that woman show up in the image? So it's the image classification. It's the emotion classification. So these are the 20 persona conditions we vary. So we have a control condition. Basically, we don't have any identity. We don't tell GPT-4 about identity. We directly ask it to classify the image. And then in all the other conditions, we basically do all the combination of gender and race, ethnicity. So I want to show you some of the findings about, again, go back to the concept of refusal rate. So on the y-axis, you see here, we call percentage, right? It's the percentage of times GPT-4 will basically decline to perform image classification tasks. So it will give response like, sorry, I can't assist you. I can't help you code the image. So it's the decline rate. And then each bar here represents the user's gender identity. So for instance, in the control condition, basically there is no identity there. We don't tell identity in the prompt. Let's see how much time GPT-4 will say, sorry, I can't assist you. And then in the green bar, it's the female. So that is where I say that, oh, I am an Asian female or white female or Latino female. So it's the female identity. How many times? What's the percentage of images GPT will decline to help? And then we have the same for the male identity, right? Transgender identity and a non-binary identity. So this is for the gender detection task. So what we found that compared to the no persona condition, so compared to the control condition, if you use certain personas in your prompt, say, oh, I am an Asian woman, or I am an Asian man. If you use certain persona in the prompt, you will receive a much lower refusal rate from GPT-4. So in the control condition, we will see that 15% of the times, GPT will say, I can't assist you. But then if you tell them your identity in terms of male or female, that rate decreased to 5%. So only 5% of the times, they will say, I can't assist you. But then if you tell GPT-4, say, I am a transgender, or I am a non-binary, that is my gender identity, we found that GPT 40% of the time, 30 to 40% of the time, it will decline to assist users with that type of prompt. And then we found this similar pattern again, when it comes to ask it to do other tasks like reasoning, right? Not just doing classification of gender, but ask it, oh, can you tell me what is the features in this image which make you think that image represents a woman or man, etc. Again, if the user's identity, right, in the prompt is transgender, which across all the race ethnicity group, then they also gonna receive a much higher refusal rate compared to if the user is female, male. So that is also same true. And then when we look into the emotions associated with the image, so we ask GPT, okay, you say that is an image describe a female. Can you tell me what is the emotion you see there? And we ask a bunch of different emotions. So for the emotion here, we ask about, we give it a choice, we give it a coding about angry, disgust, fear, happy, sad, surprise, and neutral. And then the percentage here on the y-axis is the percentage that emotion is associated with female images. So what we find in terms of the emotion is GPT tend to associate more happiness with female images. So if it say that, oh, that image describe a woman, it will have much more higher frequency of saying, oh, the facial expression is happy compared to if say that image is a man. And when it comes to male images, the dominant emotion they will say that showing in that image is more likely to be neutral. So the emotion is neutral when it's associated with male images. So this is where actually we found that, when we think about the rejection, right, refusal, that's a very important way before we even think about how they classify these tasks, how they do the task. Refuse to help users is even a more front-end problem, right? And actually, there are some of the news talking about actually ChatGPT rejected lots of images of presidential candidates before the election day. So that's not just about the task we do here. So again, going back to the key argument I want to share with you, right? We see that from both the dialogue as well as the image classification, right, study, we do see that user identity matters for large language models responses. So what are some of the ways we think about the implication, right, of these studies? So the first is about more on the methodological implication. So in communication, we often like to do content analysis, right? We often ask, those large language models to classify content. It could be a social media message, or it could be like the image we do. So taking, our image analysis study as an example, we see that, one kind of the key important way of doing content analysis is in the social science, we need to have something called inter-coder reliability. So you basically want a group of coders who are diverse enough to code to do this classification task to ensure that the way of you interpret things is consistent. And then we see this, for those GPT, it provides an opportunity for us to design persona, which basically mimic those real group of students, right, who do this content analysis. So it actually helps us to do more easily to, do intercoder agreement check by just vary the persona. But what we see here is you will get higher refusal rate if you tell GPT that this user is from certain persona. And in our case, is what we see is about the certain gender, right? So then, what is the criteria that you will ensure intercoder reliability when you ask GPT to do content analysis? So for instance, if it continue to decline certain users, they are way of thinking about image classification. Are you just gonna take the majority of the people who give classification, or you're gonna care a lot about those people who are being declined in doing the tasks? So this is actually a methodological challenge when we think about we want to give those LLMs to do some of the tasks to assist, human researchers. And then there is also a social implication for how we think about broadly, human-computer interaction here. So what we see here first is, if we think about those AI system, we want to build a more democratic tool for different users, right, different social groups to do tasks, to fully utilize those systems, right, to increase productivity. Then if it tend to decline certain users for certain tasks, then basically it's really going to be very discouraging for those users if they want to use the system, right, to do tasks, to help them, increase their productivity. So that is kind of like the question is, how do we think about it as a democratic tool for different social group? And also a second thing from this study, which my group, think a lot is, in terms of AI system, is refusing to perform tasks on sensitive topics like please classify the gender in the image, right? So that is a quite high-stake issue. So is the refusing this kind of reply, to the users, is that ethical or not? What is the role we think about those AI systems when we ask them about high-stake issue? What is the ethical way of how they should provide responses when they have dialogue with users, or when they do those image classification tasks on these high-stake issues, instead of just saying, sorry, I cannot assist you. So I want to kind of leave this question here, and I very much look forward for your suggestions and thoughts. Thank you so much.